Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. I want to take some time to thank the Canadian Club of Ottawa, the Security and Policy Institute at the University of Ottawa for putting together this gathering and for inviting me. I'm honored to come and share my thoughts on a topic that affects us all and requires all of us to do some deep thinking and collective action as Canadians. I'm going to speak for roughly about 20 minutes so that we can have time for Q&A, question and answer, because I really feel that after lunch, I don't want to put people to sleep, and by having that interactive session, it'll be more fruitful. So the way I'm going to approach this, let's see if this works. Okay, thank you. So first, we're going to try to understand what is ISIS. So we've heard the name. A lot has been written on it. And when a lot is written on something in a very short period of time, it confuses more so than clarifies. And that's why I think that we should spend a few minutes trying to understand what is ISIS. ISIS is basically the successor to Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, imagine yourself on September 11, 2001, or shortly thereafter, and Al-Qaeda was the big thing. Fortunately, we have succeeded in destroying that threat in terms of the original organization that was Al-Qaeda, the one that planned the attacks of September 11, and had many other plans in the pipeline, had the United States and Canada and our allies not acted the way we did. But as is the case with every single human action, the law of unintended consequences is always there. And inadvertently, in order to fix things, we also lead to situations that create more problems. So while Al-Qaeda, the organization, is gone, in fact, as I was getting off the plane today, the president announced from the White House that a major Al-Qaeda operative who was of an American descent, Adam Gaddan, had been killed back in January. And so Al-Qaeda is a shell of its former self. But in the process, we have what is called the fragmentation or the devolution of Al-Qaeda. And that devolution, in other words, the opening up of sort of regional groups that used to be franchises, affiliated groups with Al-Qaeda, those became sort of the prominent players in this global jihadist war. And out of those franchises emerged ISIS, and it was in Iraq. And I say unintended consequences is because the move to effect regime change in Iraq created the conditions in which ISIS could emerge and become what it is today. I'm talking about the collapse of the Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein and the anarchy that was there and the United States tried to manage for a very, very long time, for a good 8 years. And in that context, we saw the rise of a group called Jamaat Tawheed wal Jihad. I don't think anybody of you has probably heard of it. It no longer exists because it metamorphed into different organizations, making its way into ISIS. So ISIS started out as a very small group, did 2 bombings in Iraq in 2003. The next year, that group, led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, essentially had bigger ambitions, and he and his group needed the Al-Qaeda brand. So they joined Al-Qaeda, pledged allegiance to bin Laden, and called themselves Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And from there, they put roots in Iraq because of the disenfranchised Sunni minority in Iraq. They took advantage of that. They gained a lot of recruits, and they became what is called ISI, or the Islamic State of Iraq. And this continued all the way until 2011. And this is before the Arab Spring. And it was, in fact, this group, ISI, the predecessor to ISIS, actually suffered a decline in 2007 and 2008 when the United States was able to cut a deal with the Sunnis of Iraq and turn them against ISI. But when the United States forces moved out of Iraq and the Shiite-dominated government wanted to basically reinforce its hold over the country, they reneged on their pledges to the Sunni community. And the Sunni community went back to ISI, or at least a good chunk of it, lots of tribal elders and youth. And at the same time, the Arab Spring came around. And the Arab Spring reached Syria. And very quickly, a popular uprising of civil unrest, people just protesting and demanding, more freedoms, democracy, rule of law against the regime of President Bashar al-Assad, that turned into a civil war, an armed uprising. And that's what ISI latched onto and quickly moved in because they were positioned next door in Iraq, and they were able to take advantage of the situation and became the biggest militia in Syria. And not only that, we know that they also took control of oil fields and began to bankroll essentially this global ambition to spread their tentacles across the Muslim world and beyond. And this is where it's different from Al-Qaeda. So for the first time, you have a group that's not a terrorist organization in the classic sense of the word. It's more an insurgent movement. And more importantly, it is somewhere between a non-state actor and a state actor because it's administering areas in Iraq and Syria. And therefore, that's what makes it more lethal. It controls territory, and it is taking advantage of a sectarian conflict inside the Levantine and Mesopotamian landmass, which is Syria and Iraq. And if you notice, there is a connection between what is the various threads or the currents that are taking place in the Middle East. First is what I call geosectarianism, the fight between the Iranian-led Shia camp and the Saudi-led Sunni camp. And ISIS knows how to exploit this very well. ISIS built itself upon the initial such battle in Iraq and has basically catapulted itself by going into Syria and creating this so-called caliphate in 2014, last June. But at the same time, it also saw the meltdown of autocratic regimes. So you have Yemen is in the news these days because Yemen is where another sectarian battleground that's unfolding, and in many ways is becoming much more prominent than Syria and Iraq. Lebanon has always been that way. And then there's Libya. There is the calm before the storm, as I call it, in Egypt. And the list goes on. And so this is another regional dynamic that ISIS exploits in order to advance itself. And so, in other words, the combination of the sectarian strife and the sectarian strife and the collapse of regimes is creating ungoverned spaces that are being taken over by ISIS and groups like ISIS. Can we go to the next slide, please? I've already talked about how, the reason why ISIS is far more of a threat than Al-Qaeda, because it's not the Afghan Taliban who are confined within the boundaries of the nation state of Afghanistan, and we call them nationalist jihadists. It is a transnational group that seeks to essentially erase borders that have existed since the end of the First or the Second World War. And if you notice, Al-Qaeda had the same ideal, But what al-Qaeda didn't have was the capability or the sophistication to put those ideals into practice. So al-Qaeda was more about attacks in the West. ISIS is about holding territory. And that's what gives it not just more power in terms of physical military capability, but also appeal across the world, where youth are around the world, and not just in Muslim countries, but in the West, here in Canada, where people are attracted to this idea that there is this group that is standing up against the United States. So it feeds into anti-Americanism. It feeds into other sentiments that people have if they're disenfranchised socially, politically, economically. And this is the tool that it has in order to reach into our world where we live, especially Canada and the United States. Because we're part of the West, we are by default seen as the enemy. And of course, we can't just sit and say, okay, let the United States take care of this. We have to do our part. It is in our national security interest to go out there and deal with this threat with our partners from Europe and south of the border, as well as our regional allies. And that sort of adds to that hatred that these people have for Canada and magnifies it. And imagine the mind of a young person here in Canada thinking along these lines, subscribing to this view that this country that I live in is not really my country. I live here, I happen to be here because I was born here and I have no control over it, but this is a country that is at war with my people. If you look at the videos of youth, men and women, with French accents, British accents, saying that I am fighting you because you are at war with my people. We have a serious problem in terms of loyalty, in terms of allegiances. And therefore, we cannot afford to say, this is a problem that exists over there, we will do what we can, and life goes on. We have to take this much, much more seriously. We are not equipped to dealing with this threat, despite all that we're doing. I don't mean to say that the government is not doing its job, but the magnitude of the problem is as such that there's a lot more that needs to be done in terms of not just militarily, politically, just basically educating ourselves and getting up to speed as to what is it that we're really dealing with here. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I've already talked about how we are affected. And we're a country of immigrants. And immigration is not going to stop. Immigration comes from all over the world. And we're going to have a lot of people from the areas that ISIS is either physically present in or has its tentacles reaching into it. And we cannot say that we will, we'll have immigrants who come here who won't have, this at least if you will, an attraction for such ideas. They may not like ISIS. So notice that Al-Qaeda has been condemning ISIS, and there's a competition going on. Some people may not be with ISIS. They may be with Al-Qaeda. They may not be with Al-Qaeda. They may be with some other group. There are dozens of groups with similar viewpoints, only so many degrees separated from each other ideologically, that are operating on the battlefield in Syria. And those people are reaching out through social media, through the use of technology. We use technology to better ourselves and improve our lives. These people are using technology to do away with what we cherish: the rule of law, democracy, economic prosperity, freedom. So our own media, our own infrastructure is being used against us. And this is something that we have to recognize. And there are many people here in this country who, because for one reason or the other, perhaps they don't know better. Perhaps they have, wholeheartedly subscribed to the ideology of ISIS and global jihadism. But they're here who go on the internet and they're attracted to these ideas because we don't have, or we have not been able to provide them with a counter-narrative, a narrative that can effectively undermine, deconstruct such ideas. And therefore, it's no surprise that we have news of teenagers, young girls, boys going over to places like Syria and Iraq, Somalia, and North Africa, and then the Sahel region, where they are, affiliated with Boko Haram or, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or whatever organization that they can affiliate with. We have a job here, a job to make sure that we protect our youth that lives here, and the people that immigrate to this country. They are part of a Canadian mainstream life. So one of the problems that we have is, and this is the contradiction within our immigration policy, is that we need immigration, you can't stop that, but we really don't do a good job of integrating those people. So once they get land, and we have our own processes, we have the public school system, we have everything, but it's not sufficient. And the situation is going to get worse as time goes by. Why do I say that? Is because here, we're not going to see, God forbid we see the day that, we see government collapse. But governments are collapsing in the Middle East. So if there are no arresters to ISIS in the Middle East, then imagine the kind of, fallout that's going to radiate out of that region and touch our shores and Europe and other parts of the world. And this is why you see different capitals, from Australia to Russia, to even African countries like Kenya, after the recent unfortunate incident there, that everybody's alarmed. But the question is, what can we do? Next slide, please. I think our most effective weapon is to work with Muslim communities. Because at the end of the day, we can do security in terms of law enforcement, in terms of immigration. It is the job of government to provide security. It is the primary duty of any government to provide security to its citizens. And our forces do a great job at that. But it is not the job of government to tell people what their religion is. And that's why it is important to have a challenge to ISIS from within, its own context. And there's a lot of resources that need to be harnessed and that we can make use of. But that's only one step in that direction. What we also need is to upgrade our own security capabilities. We don't have a dedicated foreign intelligence service in this country. We didn't need one for the longest time. But ladies and gentlemen, we do need one now. And we will need one as the days and weeks and months and years roll on, because the situation in the rest of the world is not getting better. There is more and more fragmentation. For as long as one can remember, speakers come in various gatherings around the world and say, we live in a very dangerous time. And that is true. Every time is dangerous. But every people, every context is relevant to those who live in it. So this is our dangerous time. We've long moved away from the dynamic or the context of the Cold War, and this is the new world that we live in, and this is a world that we do not really have a pattern to understand, because we're used to fighting. We're used to wars between countries, or maybe civil wars between one part of the country and another part of that country. North Yemen versus South Yemen in the 1980s and the 1990s. We're used to, the Cold War logic of West Germany and East Germany. The world isn't neatly divided like that anymore. The world, when you have regimes collapsing across the region, when you have population growth, where, the resources of a given country are far less than what the demand is from their public, then you have these chaotic situations. And we cannot afford We cannot think that we will have our perfect little order in a globe filled with chaos. So we have to step up, and we have to be able to dedicate more internationally. And that's why I talk about a dedicated foreign intelligence service. Likewise, I was astonished a few years ago, it was several years ago, when I first found out that we don't have more than 80,000 troops, tops. You know, we're a country of 33 million people, very large country by geography, one of the G8 countries, at a time when the United States is really exhausted from all the various issues that it has to deal with, and Europe is in a crisis. We are the only Western country, or in the country in the Western Hemisphere, that is free from problems, and therefore, if we want to stay that way, then we need to be able to have upgrade that military capability. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take years, perhaps decades. I'm not saying that all of a sudden we should set a target for 300,000 troops that we need to recruit, train, and have a standing army. But the world's problems are increasing, and 80,000 or 75,000 troops just doesn't cut it. Of course, we've been part of NATO. We've been part of, we've relied heavily on Big Brother south of the border. The Big Brother is, as I said, really being stretched. If you look at the way the problems are magnifying, the problems in the Middle East, and I'm not talking about Ukraine, Russia, I'm not talking about the Far East or any other part of the world. If you just look at the Middle East, I'm not even talking about South Asia, so forget Afghanistan and Pakistan. Just look at the Middle East. The problems of the Middle East have magnified to a point where it is not possible for the United States military to impose order in that area, which is why we're seeing this new doctrine emerge under President Obama, which says regional powers have to take the lead. In other words, the United States needs partners and allies. We're not going to be a partner just because we live north of the border. It's in our self-interest to be a partner. And we have to understand that we haven't done this. We play small time or minor league geopolitics. It's time to play major league geopolitics. It's actually it's high time that we do that. We have to step up, and the way to step up is to increase our capabilities militarily from an intelligence point of view. We have to better understand the world. We have to understand who we're dealing with. And it's for me, for a person who values academia and just the general epistemic community, we are deficient in epistemic communities. We don't have think tanks. We have small institutions, but we're really way behind. Now, I'm not saying we can compete with Washington. Washington is at a different scale. But we really need to do more in terms of having think tanks and people studying, graduate students going on to doing jobs in this field of international affairs. Understanding the world out there is the first step to protecting ourselves. And ISIS will wither away just like Al-Qaeda. It will take another name. The threat is not going away. Ladies and gentlemen, we are talking about a multi-generational process. This problem we will have long after each one of us is no more. I hate to sound morbid, but I want to make the point that our children and grandchildren will still be dealing with this problem. I mean, if you look at history, how wars and conflicts have unfolded, they were not solved in a matter of years. And this one conflict, because it has a religious overtones, it's about how Muslims, should be Muslims in the here and now. That's a very challenging question for everyone, for us, for the people who believe in the religion, and for those who speak in the name of the religion. And so I cannot emphasize enough how the scale and the magnitude of the work that lays in front of us. And I just hope that we will be moving towards that point when we are much more better equipped to dealing with this. I'll end, but I want to end on a positive note. I want to thank and I want to recognize all the Canadians who are out there in the world working, whether they're in the armed forces, they're in academia, they're in the medical field, they're businessmen, or they're just expat workers, and they're trying to make this world a much better place. They need help, and we can help them. Thank you.